He's just a useless driver. Why is he even here?
Under the harsh midday sun outside St. Raphael Mercy Hospital in Lagos, a crowd gathered drawn by tension they could feel but not explain. In the middle of it stood a man in a faded driver's uniform, sweat soaking through his shirt, his eyes fixed on the hospital doors. Voices cut through the heat, sharp, cruel, impatient. He's just a useless driver. Why is he even here? The man said nothing. His hands trembled slightly as if holding back something far heavier than fear. Then the doors burst open. A doctor rushed out, scanning the crowd before calling out loud and clear, "Mr. Nasir Ahmed, we need your decision now." The insults died instantly. Every face froze. And in that blinding daylight, nothing made sense anymore. Before we go into this story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you believe stories like this still matter, don't forget to subscribe. Morning always came early for Nasir Ahmed. Long before the sun rose fully over Lagos, before the streets filled with horns and shouting vendors, he was already awake. In the small, modest room he rented on the outskirts of the city, Nasir sat on the edge of his bed, tying his worn shoes with slow, deliberate care. His movements were calm, almost ritualistic, as if each morning was a quiet agreement he made with himself to endure whatever the day would bring. Outside, the city breathed in layers, dust, heat, noise, and struggle. Nasir stepped into it without complaint. At Ahmed Logistics Limited, the compound began to stir as other workers arrived. Security guards nodded at one another. Cleaners swept the yard. Drivers gathered near their vehicles, laughing loudly, complaining about fuel prices and traffic. Nasir greeted everyone the same way, with a soft, "Good morning," and a polite smile. Most people barely responded. Some didn't even look at him. To them, he was just another driver. Worse, an old one. His uniform was clean but clearly worn. The edges of his sleeves had faded. His shoes, though polished, had seen better days. In a company where appearances often mattered more than character, Nasir's quiet presence made him easy to dismiss. He didn't mind. Nasir walked straight to his assigned vehicle and began his routine. He checked the tires, carefully wiped the dashboard, adjusted the mirrors, and cleaned the windows until they reflected the morning light. He worked slowly, attentively, like a man who took pride in things others found insignificant. As he worked, conversations floated around him. "Did you hear Victor Okafor is coming in early today?" one driver whispered. "Of course," another replied. "When does that man ever arrive late?" a third voice snorted. "As long as you're not in his way, you're fine. If you are—" The sentence ended with a low laugh. Nasir heard everything. He always did, but he never reacted. Years of observation had taught him that silence often revealed more than words. Inside the office building, the mood shifted. Air conditioners hummed, shoes clicked against tiled floors. Employees straightened their posture as Victor Okafor walked in, tall and confident, his suit sharp, his expression permanently unimpressed. People greeted him loudly, almost desperately. "Good morning, sir." "Morning, Mr. Okafor." Victor acknowledged them with brief nods, his eyes already scanning for mistakes, weaknesses, someone to assert authority over. Beside him walked Linda Okafor, elegant and perfectly styled, her heels echoing with confidence. She smiled at the attention, enjoying the silent recognition of status. When Victor reached the front desk, Grace Williams stood up immediately. "Good morning, sir. Your schedule for today?" Victor cut her off with a raised hand. "Later. Where's the driver?" Grace hesitated for a moment. "Which driver, sir?" "The one assigned to me today," Victor said impatiently. "The older one." Grace knew exactly who he meant. She glanced toward the window and saw Nasir outside, wiping the side mirror of the car. Calm, focused. "He's outside, sir," she replied. Victor scoffed. "Of course he is, still pretending that cleaning makes up for being slow." Linda leaned closer to her husband, lowering her voice, but not enough. "I don't know why they keep him. He looks like someone who should have retired years ago." Grace forced a polite smile and said nothing. But something about the way Victor spoke always unsettled her. Not just the arrogance, but the ease with which he stripped people of dignity. Outside, Victor approached Nasir with long, impatient strides. "Driver," he called out sharply. Nasir turned immediately. "Good morning, sir." Victor looked him up and down. "You're late." Nasir glanced at his watch. "I arrived 40 minutes ago, sir." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Are you arguing with me?" "No, sir," Nasir said gently. "I was just clarifying." Victor waved his hand dismissively. Just make sure you don't waste my time today. Some of us have real responsibilities. Nasir nodded. Yes, sir. Linda watched the exchange with mild amusement. To her, Nasir wasn't a man, he was background noise. As Nasser opened the car door for Victor and Linda Grace observed from inside the building, she noticed something she had noticed many times before. Nasir never rushed, but he was never slow. He never showed fear, but he never showed pride either. There was a strange balance to him, like someone who had nothing to prove. During the drive, Victor barked instructions from the back seat. Take the third exit, not the second. You missed a turn yesterday. Watch that car. Are you blind? Each comment landed like an insult, but Nasir absorbed them quietly, his hands steady on the steering wheel. He knew Lagos traffic well. He knew when to slow down, when to push forward. And despite Victor's complaints, they arrived earlier than expected. Victor checked his watch and frowned, almost disappointed. Inside the building, Nasir waited by the car as instructed. Drivers were expected to wait, to stand, to be available, but invisible. As minutes turned into hours, Nasir watched people come and go. Employees rushed in and out, some stressed, some laughing, some complaining. He noticed who greeted the security guards and who ignored them, who spoke kindly to cleaners and who didn't. He noticed everything. This was not new to him. Years ago, Nasir Ahmed had stood in places like this as a man with power, as a man whose signature could change lives. But power had taught him something painful. People rarely revealed their true character when they thought you were important. They performed. They pretended. So he had chosen a different path, a path where no one clapped for him, where no one feared him, where he could see humanity unfiltered. When Victor finally returned, irritated and complaining about meetings, Nasir opened the door again without a word. Next time, Victor muttered, try to look more alert. You drivers always look half asleep. Nasir met his eyes briefly. Calm, respectful. Yes, sir. Grace saw that look from across the parking lot. Not defiance, not submission. Something deeper. That afternoon, as Nasir drove the car back into position and shut off the engine, he rested his hands on the steering wheel for a moment longer than usual. His face showed no anger, but his eyes carried weight memories, decisions, patience. The day had only just begun, and in a company that believed it knew exactly who he was. Nasir Ahmed continued to walk quietly unseen, gathering truths that would one day demand to be heard. By mid-morning, the atmosphere inside Ahmed Logistics Limited had shifted. Emails flew back and forth. Phones rang without rest. A delayed shipment from the port had caused confusion and tension, crept into every corner of the building. When problems appeared, Victor Okafor always appeared bigger, louder, sharper, more aggressive. He stood in the open office area now, sleeves rolled up, voice carrying across desks and cubicles. Who approved this route, he demanded. No one answered at first. Heads lowered, fingers froze above keyboards. I asked a simple question, Victor snapped. Do I have to remind everyone who runs operations here? A young supervisor cleared his throat. Sir, the route was suggested last week because Victor cut him off with a scoff. Suggested by who? The supervisor hesitated, eyes darting toward the window. One of the drivers mentioned it during a conversation. Victor turned sharply toward the glass, spotting Nasser outside, standing beside his vehicle, waiting as usual. Of course, Victor said loudly. The drivers are giving advice now. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the office. Victor walked straight out into the open yard, his footsteps quick and deliberate. Linda followed, arms crossed, already wearing a knowing smile. Several staff members drifted closer, pretending to be busy while watching what they sensed would become another public display. Driver Victor barked again. Nasir turned calm as ever. Yes, sir. Victor stopped a few feet from him. I hear you've been making suggestions about logistics routes. Nasir nodded slightly. I only mentioned what I've observed on the road, sir. Traffic patterns have changed near the port. Victor laughed, sharp and dismissive. Observed. From behind a steering wheel, Nasir said nothing. Victor's voice grew louder. Let me make something very clear. You are here to drive, not to think, not to advise, just to drive. Linda stepped forward, tilting her head as she studied Nasser. Honestly, she said, I don't understand why some people don't know their place. The words landed hard. Several employees shifted uncomfortably. Grace Williams stood near the door, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Nasir kept his gaze steady. I understand my role, ma'am. Victor scoffed. Good. Because the last thing this company needs is a useless driver thinking he's smarter than management. The word useless hung in the air, heavy and intentional. A few people laughed nervously again. Others looked away ashamed. Grace felt heat rise in her chest. She wanted to speak. She wanted to say something, anything. But fear held her back. Victor had power. Nasir did not. At least that was how it appeared. Nasir nodded once. "I apologize if I overstepped, sir." Victor waved him off. "Just stay where you belong." As Victor and Linda walked away satisfied, Nasir remained standing exactly where he was. He waited until they were out of sight before exhaling slowly. Nearby, Tunda Balogan approached cautiously. "Oga Nasir," he said quietly, using the respectful term without thinking. "I'm sorry about that." Nasir smiled faintly. "No need to apologize, Tunda, but they didn't have to talk to you like that." Nasir looked at him thoughtfully. "People speak from who they are, not from who you are." Tunde frowned, trying to understand. "Doesn't it bother you?" The way they talked, Nasir considered the question. "It used to," he said honestly. "But now I listen more than I react." Tunde shook his head. "If it were me, I would have left." Nasir placed a hand briefly on Tunde's shoulder. "Sometimes staying teaches you more than leaving." Inside the office, Victor continued his display of authority. He gathered the supervisors for a quick meeting, pointing fingers, assigning blame, raising his voice. Linda stood nearby, scrolling through her phone occasionally, adding sarcastic remarks that drew laughter from those eager to please. Grace sat at her desk, her mind far from her screen. She replayed the scene in her head, Victor's words. Nasir's calm, the way no one defended him. A strange discomfort settled in her chest. She had worked here long enough to recognize competence when she saw it, and something about Nasir didn't fit the picture Victor painted. Later that afternoon, as the sun beat down harder and tempers grew shorter, the delayed shipment issue escalated. The alternative route Victor had approved became gridlocked. Drivers called in frustrated and confused. Time slipped away. Costs rose. Victor slammed his hand on the conference table. Unbelievable. How did this happen? No one answered. Grace hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Sir, the driver mentioned earlier the route he suggested might avoid this congestion." Victor shot her a look. "Are you siding with the driver now?" "No, sir," Grace said quickly. "I'm just saying it might be worth considering." Victor laughed coldly. "I will not run my company based on roadside advice from a useless driver." The room fell silent. Outside, Nasir watched trucks struggle through traffic in the distance. He knew those roads. He knew exactly where the bottleneck was forming and why. His phone buzzed with a message from another driver confirming his suspicion. Nasir closed his eyes briefly. Grace stepped outside moments later, pretending to take a call. She walked toward Nasir, lowering her voice. "You were right, weren't you?" Nasir looked at her. "About the route." She nodded. "They're stuck." Nasir sighed softly. "I hoped they wouldn't be." Grace studied him closely. "Why do you stay?" The question surprised him. He paused before answering. "Because leaving would be easy," he said. "And because sometimes truth needs time." Grace felt a chill run through her. "You don't sound like a driver." Nasir smiled gently. "Appearances can be deceiving." From the office doorway, Linda watched them speaking. Her eyes narrowed. She nudged Victor. "Your driver is chatting again." Victor glanced over, irritation flaring. "Unbelievable." He stormed outside once more. "What's this now?" he snapped. "Private meetings." Grace stiffened. "Sir, I was just—" Victor raised a hand. "I don't want excuses." He turned to Nasir. "Since you think you know so much, why don't you fix the problem?" Nasir met his gaze. "If you allow me, sir, I can suggest an alternative immediately." Victor laughed loudly. "You hear this?" he said to those watching. "The useless driver wants to save the day." Laughter followed louder this time. Nasir waited until the noise died down. "Whether you take the suggestion or not is your choice," he said calmly. "But the delay will cost the company far more than pride." The yard went quiet. Victor's face hardened. "You're crossing a line." Nasir nodded. "Perhaps." For a moment it looked like Victor might explode. Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Know your place," he whispered, "or you won't have one here." Nasir held his gaze without flinching. "I understand, sir." Victor turned away, anger simmering, his authority restored for now. As the afternoon dragged on and losses mounted, whispers spread among the staff. Some began to wonder if the quiet driver might not be so useless after all. Others clung to fear, choosing silence over truth. Nasir returned to his position beside the car, standing patiently in the heat, his expression unchanged. But deep inside, he felt the slow turning of something inevitable. The insults had grown louder. The stakes had risen, and the company was moving step by step toward a reckoning no one yet understood. The late afternoon sun hung low over the compound of Ahmed Logistics Limited, casting long shadows across the parked vehicles and the cracked concrete yard. The heat had softened slightly, but the tension from earlier still clung to the air like dust after traffic. Drivers gathered in small clusters, murmuring about the delays, the shouting, and Victor Okafor's latest outburst. Nasir Ahmed stood apart from them, as he always did. He leaned lightly against the side of his vehicle, his eyes following the movement of trucks at the far gate. To anyone watching, he looked like a man waiting for instructions. But in his stillness, he was thinking, connecting patterns, weighing decisions, measuring people not by their words but by their reactions under pressure. Nearby, Tunda Balogan sat on the edge of a low concrete step, his head buried in his hands. His shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of exhaustion deeper than physical fatigue. Nasir noticed immediately. He walked over quietly. "Tunde," he said softly. Tunde looked up, startled. His eyes were red. "Oga Nasir." Nasir sat beside him, leaving a respectful distance. "What's wrong?" Tunde hesitated, then let out a long breath. "They say the delay is my fault," Victor shouted at me inside. "Said I should be grateful I still have a job." Nasir listened without interrupting. I followed the instructions I was given. Tunde continued. "But now everyone is looking at me like I caused everything." Nasir nodded slowly. "Did you do your job?" "Yes," Tunde said quickly. "Exactly as they said. Then you have done nothing wrong," Nasir replied. Tunde laughed bitterly. "That's not how it works here." Nasir turned to face him. "It should be." Tunde studied Nasir's face, searching for sarcasm, but found none. "How do you stay so calm?" he asked. "They insult you. They talk to you like you are nothing. Don't you ever feel angry?" Nasir paused. He chose his words carefully. "Anger gives power to those who provoke it," he said. "I prefer to keep mine." Tunde shook his head. "I wish I could be like you." Nasir smiled faintly. "You already are stronger than you think." As they spoke, Grace Williams stepped out of the building, holding a stack of files against her chest. She scanned the yard and spotted the two men sitting together. Something about the image made her slow her steps. She walked over. "Tunde," she said gently, "Victor wants to see you later." Tunde's shoulders stiffened. Again, Grace nodded apologetically. Then she turned to Nasir. "I'm sorry about earlier," she said quietly. "The way they spoke to you, it wasn't right." Nasir inclined his head. "Thank you for saying that." Grace hesitated. "You didn't deserve it." Nasir looked at her with calm eyes. "Deserving has little to do with how people behave." Grace studied him, a question forming on her lips, but before she could speak, a shout cut through the yard. "Tunde, get over here now, Victor!" Okafor stood at the doorway, arms crossed, irritation written across his face. Tunde stood slowly, his hands shaking. Nasir rose with him. "I'll come with you," Nasir said quietly. Tunde looked surprised. Sir Nasir nodded. "You won't face it alone." They walked toward the building together. Grace watched them go, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't fully explain. Inside the office, Victor paced back and forth like a caged animal. Linda sat nearby, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up with bored interest. So Victor said sharply as Tunde entered, "You think you can waste company resources and walk away?" Tunde opened his mouth, but his voice failed him. Nasir stepped forward calmly. "Sir." With respect, the instructions Tunde followed came directly from the operations desk. Victor turned on him instantly. "Did I ask you to speak?" Nasir met his gaze. "No, sir. But the blame is being misplaced." Linda laughed softly. "Listen to him. The driver has opinions again." Nasir ignored her. "If you review the call logs and route approvals, you'll see Tunde acted correctly." Victor's face darkened. "Are you challenging my authority?" "I'm clarifying facts." Nasir replied evenly. For a moment the room fell silent. Grace, standing near the doorway, held her breath. Victor leaned closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You are walking on thin ice." Nasir nodded. I understand. Victor straightened. Get out, both of you. Tunde looked confused. Sir, I said get out. Victor shouted. They turned and left without another word. Outside, Tunde's legs nearly gave way. I'm finished, he said quietly. They will fire me. Nasir placed a steady hand on his shoulder. No, he said firmly. This is not the end. How can you be so sure? Tunde asked. Nasir looked toward the horizon where the sun dipped lower, because injustice has a way of exposing itself. Later that evening, as the compound emptied and engines cooled, Nasir remained. He helped another driver fix a loose cable. He shared his water with a cleaner who had forgotten hers. Small acts unnoticed by those in power, but deeply felt by those on the margins. Grace watched from her desk window as Nasir handed Tunde some notes explaining something patiently. She felt a quiet shift inside her, a realization that leadership did not always announce itself with titles or raised voices. As darkness began to settle, Victor's car pulled out of the compound tires, screeching slightly as if carrying his frustration with him. Linda followed soon after, laughing into her phone. Nasir stood by his vehicle, the yard almost empty now. Tunde approached him one last time before leaving. Thank you, Tunde said, for standing up for me. Nasir smiled gently. One day you'll do the same for someone else. Tunde nodded, emotion thick in his throat. Alone again, Nasir sat in the driver's seat but did not start the engine immediately. He rested his forehead briefly against the steering wheel, not in weakness, but in quiet reflection. He thought of the many times he had been overlooked, insulted, dismissed. He thought of the people who suffered silently because speaking out felt dangerous, and he thought of the truth waiting patiently like a seed beneath the soil. The company believed it knew who he was. But each act of cruelty, each careless insult was drawing the story closer to a moment when silence would no longer be possible. And when that moment came, it would not be fueled by anger but by clarity. The next morning arrived with an uneasy stillness, the kind that settles over a place after too much noise the day before. At Ahmed Logistics Limited, the compound felt tighter, as if the walls themselves were listening. Drivers arrived quietly. Office staff spoke in hushed tones. Everyone knew something was wrong, even if no one dared to say it out loud. Nasir Ahmed arrived as usual before most others. He parked his vehicle carefully, stepped out, and took a slow look around. The air carried the weight of unresolved tension. He could sense it in the way security guards avoided eye contact and how drivers clustered closer together than normal. Inside the building, Victor Okafor was already pacing. The delayed shipment had not resolved overnight. Instead, it had grown into a full-blown crisis. Clients were calling. Penalties were stacking up. One major customer had threatened to terminate their contract if the goods did not arrive by noon. Victor slammed his office door shut, then opened it again almost immediately. Meeting. Now he barked. Supervisors rushed in. Grace took her seat near the corner, her notebook open, but her mind unsettled. She could feel Victor's anger radiating across the room like heat. How did this get worse? Victor demanded. Someone explain to me how a simple routing issue is now threatening our biggest account. A supervisor cleared his throat. Sir, the trucks are still stuck near the port. The congestion spread overnight. Victor turned sharply. And the alternative routes? They were never approved, sir. Victor's jaw tightened. For a brief second, an uncomfortable truth hovered in the room. The truth everyone was avoiding. Grace spoke carefully. Sir, if we reroute the remaining trucks through the inland bypass, now we might still meet the deadline. Victor's eyes flicked to her. And where did that idea come from? Grace hesitated. From observations made yesterday. Victor's face darkened. By whose silence? Victor knew the answer already. He leaned back in his chair and laughed a short, bitter sound. So now when things go wrong, we're suddenly ready to listen to drivers. No one responded. Victor stood abruptly. Fine, bring him. Grace's heart skipped. Sir? The driver. Victor snapped. Nasir, if he thinks he has solutions, let him say them in front of everyone. Grace stood slowly. I'll call him. Minutes later, Nasir entered the conference room. His posture was relaxed, his expression neutral. He nodded respectfully to everyone before stopping near the door. You wanted to see me, sir? He asked. Victor folded his arms. You've been very vocal lately, talking about routes, traffic, delays. Nasir met his gaze. Only when asked, sir. Victor smirked. Well, now I'm asking, what is your brilliant idea? The room held its breath. Nasir stepped forward slightly. If the trucks at the port reverse course and take the inland bypass through Ibafo, then connect to the old express route before the bridge, they can avoid the congestion entirely. It will add distance but save time. A supervisor blinked. That route is rarely used. Nasir nodded, which is why it's clear. Victor scoffed. And you know this because I've driven those roads for years, Nasir replied simply. Victor waved a hand dismissively. Even if you're right, implementing that now would be risky. Nasir looked around the room. So is doing nothing. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one supervisor leaned forward. Sir, he might be right. At this point, we don't have many options. Victor's eyes flashed. He hated being cornered. Hated even more that the suggestion came from someone he had publicly humiliated. But the clock was ticking. Fine, Victor said sharply. We'll try it. But if this fails, the responsibility is yours. Nasir nodded. I understand. The meeting ended abruptly. Orders were sent out. Phones rang again, this time with urgency. Drivers were instructed to change routes immediately. Outside, Nasir stood near the gate as trucks began to turn around. Tunda Balogan approached him, eyes wide. Oga Nasir, they're using your route, he whispered. Nasir gave a small smile. Let's hope it helps. An hour passed, then another. Grace sat at her desk refreshing her screen constantly. Her heart pounded with each update. Then, slowly, the reports began to change. Truck 1 clear, Truck 2 moving fast, ETA improving. A murmur spread through the office. Victor watched the numbers on his screen, his expression tightening. Against his will, the situation was stabilizing. By late morning, the first delivery reached its destination. The client confirmed receipt. A wave of relief swept through the building. Grace looked toward the window where Nasir stood in the yard, exactly where he had been all morning. Calm. Waiting. Victor stormed out of his office and walked straight toward Nasir. You got lucky, Victor said flatly. Nasir inclined his head. I'm glad it worked, sir. Victor hesitated, then said grudgingly, the client is satisfied. For now. Nasir said nothing. Victor's pride twisted uncomfortably in his chest. He needed control back. He needed the narrative to remain intact. Later that afternoon, Victor addressed the staff. The crisis was resolved through teamwork, he announced loudly, thanks to management's quick decisions. Some employees exchanged glances. Grace felt her jaw tighten. Nasir stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed once again. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the compound emptied, Grace approached Nasir near his vehicle. They didn't give you credit, she said softly. Nasir smiled faintly. Credit is not always visible, but it wasn't fair. Nasir looked at her kindly. Fairness has its own timing. Grace studied him. You saved the company today. Nasir shook his head. I helped it avoid a loss. There was a difference, and he knew it. As Grace walked away, Nasir sat in the driver's seat, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. He stared ahead, not at the road, but at something far beyond it. Today had been a test, not just of logistics, but of character. Victor had chosen pride over truth, again, and while the company celebrated a narrow escape, something deeper had shifted. People had seen. Whispers had started. Doubt had entered where certainty once ruled. Nasir started the engine and drove slowly out of the compound. The crisis had been survived, but the reckoning was drawing closer. That night, Lagos did not sleep easily. Traffic still groaned along the main roads, horns echoing into the darkness, while the city's lights flickered like restless thoughts. In his modest room, Nasir Ahmed sat alone, the window open to let in what little breeze there was. The events of the day replayed in his mind, not with anger, but with a quiet heaviness that came from remembering why he had chosen this path in the first place. Years ago, this room would have seemed unimaginable to him. Back then, Nasir Ahmed's life had been wrapped in glass offices, leather chairs, and endless meetings. Ahmed Holdings Group had started as nothing more than an idea and a borrowed truck. Nasir had been younger, leaner, hungrier, driven by a fierce determination to build something honest in a system that rewarded shortcuts and connections more than integrity. He remembered those early days vividly. He had driven the truck himself, sometimes sleeping inside it when contracts fell through and money ran low. People had laughed at him then, too. Banks had rejected him. Partners had smiled politely before turning him away. Even family members had warned him to be realistic, but Nasir had persisted. When success finally came, it came fast, One contract became 3, 3 became 10. Soon, Ahmed Holdings was no longer just a transport company. It was a growing force in logistics, employing hundreds, then thousands. Nasir's name began to carry weight. Doors opened, people listened. And that was when he noticed something unsettling. The same people who had once ignored him now laughed at his jokes. The same voices that had dismissed him now praised his vision. Employees spoke carefully around him, hiding mistakes, exaggerating achievements. Truth became filtered, polished, distorted. Power, Nasir realized, did not reveal character. It hid it. That realization had stayed with him, growing heavier each year. He watched managers rise, not because they were just, but because they were loud. He watched humility mistaken for weakness and cruelty mistaken for strength. Slowly, the company he had built with sacrifice began to reflect values he did not recognize. That was when he made his decision. Nasir leaned back in his chair, now remembering the shock on the faces of his board members when he announced his temporary withdrawal from visible leadership. Officially, he said he wanted to observe operations from the ground. Unofficially, many assumed he had grown tired, perhaps even lost his edge. None of them imagined how far he would go. He took on the role of a driver, not under his own name, but under minimal scrutiny, with records quietly adjusted by one trusted legal officer who owed Nasir his career. He dressed simply. He spoke less. He listened more. And what he saw broke his heart. Men like Victor Okafor thrived. Loud, domineering, obsessed with control. Victor had not always been this way, Nasir recalled. When he first hired him, Victor had seemed ambitious, capable. Somewhere along the way, authority had hardened him, sharpened his arrogance, stripped away his empathy. Nasir had hoped Victor would grow into leadership. Instead, he had grown into tyranny. Nasir stood and walked slowly across the room, his bare feet touching the cool cement floor. He poured himself a glass of water and stared at his reflection in the dim light. The face staring back at him looked older than his years, not from hardship but from patience. He knew he could end this at any moment. One phone call, one meeting, one announcement. The truth would explode through Ahmed Logistics like lightning. But would that change anything? If he revealed himself too soon, people would blame Victor alone. They would call him a bad apple, remove him, and continue as before. The deeper disease, the culture of fear, pride, and silence would remain untouched. Nasir wanted more than punishment. He wanted understanding. The next morning, he returned to work as usual. At the compound, whispers followed him. He felt it immediately. Drivers nodded with more respect. Some avoided his eyes entirely. Word of the routing crisis had spread, and with it, a quiet shift in perception. Tunde Balogun approached him, early excitement barely contained. "Oga Nasir," he said, lowering his voice. "People are talking." Nasir smiled faintly. "People always talk. They say you saved the company yesterday." Nasir shook his head. "I did my job." Tunde hesitated. "You're different, sir. I don't know how to explain it." Nasir placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then don't try." Inside the building, Victor Okafor arrived later than usual. His confidence had not vanished, but something about it felt forced now, like a performance repeated too often. He avoided direct eye contact with Nasir, addressing him only when necessary and always sharply. Grace noticed. She also noticed something else. Victor had begun taking credit more aggressively than before. He interrupted staff-dismissed questions and emphasized his authority at every turn, as if afraid it might slip away. Fear, Grace realized, often disguised itself as control. Later that day, Nasir overheard a conversation between two junior managers. "If that driver hadn't suggested the route," one said quietly, "we'd be finished." "Don't let Victor hear you," the other replied. "He hates being reminded." Nasir said nothing, but he remembered every word. At lunch, Grace joined Nasir outside, keeping her distance respectful. "You've changed things," she said softly. Nasir looked at her. "Change takes time." Grace hesitated. "Why don't you defend yourself when he insults you?" Nasir met her eyes. "Because defending myself would end the lesson too soon." Grace frowned. "What lesson?" Nasir smiled gently. "That power does not equal wisdom. And humility does not mean ignorance." Grace felt something settle into place inside her. That afternoon, Nasir received a quiet call from one of his trusted legal officers, the same man who had helped him disappear into the company months ago. "The board is restless," the man said. "They sense something is wrong." Nasir closed his eyes briefly. "Let them feel it." And Victor Nasir's voice was calm. "He is revealing himself." As the day drew to a close, Victor called for another meeting. His tone was sharp, impatient. He criticized small mistakes, raised his voice unnecessarily, and reminded everyone who was in charge. But something had changed. People listened, but they also watched. They noticed how often Victor interrupted others, how quickly he dismissed ideas that weren't his own, how defensive he became when questioned. The mask was slipping piece by piece. Nasir stood quietly at the back of the room, hands folded, eyes observant. He knew now that the company was standing at the edge of a truth it could no longer avoid. The foundation was cracking not because of rebellion, but because silence had done its work. As the meeting ended and employees filed out, Nasir remained behind for a moment, looking around the room where decisions were made, futures altered, voices silenced. Soon, very soon, the roles would reverse, and when that happened, it would not be announced with anger or pride. It would arrive calmly, like truth always does. By the end of that week, the tension at Ahmed Logistics Limited had thickened into something almost physical. It sat in the corridors and the break rooms, and the way conversations stopped abruptly whenever Victor Okafor walked past. The company was functioning, yes, but it was no longer at ease. Victor felt it. He felt it in the hesitant greetings, the delayed responses, the careful eyes that now watched him instead of shrinking away. For a man who thrived on unquestioned authority, this subtle shift was unbearable. Control, once absolute, now felt fragile. And Victor needed someone to blame. That someone in his mind was Nasser Ahmed. The opportunity came on a Friday afternoon when a routine inspection revealed an error in vehicle documentation. It was minor and administrative oversight that could be corrected in minutes, but Victor seized it like a lifeline. He stormed into the yard, papers in hand, his voice already raised. "Where is the driver responsible for vehicle L27? He shouted. Nasir looked up immediately. "That's my vehicle, sir." Victor's lips curled into a thin smile. "Perfect." Employees slowed their movements, sensing what was coming. Grace stood near the office door, her heart sinking. Tunda froze where he stood, tools still in his hands. Victor held up the papers. These documents were not updated on time. "Do you know what this means?" Nasir glanced at them calmly. "Yes, sir. It means the admin stamp is missing. The renewal itself was completed." Victor laughed loudly. "Listen to him. Explaining paperwork now." Nasir said nothing. Victor's voice sharpened. This kind of negligence could get the company fined, or worse. "And you know what we do with liabilities here, don't you?" The yard went silent. "We remove them." Victor continued. "Immediately." Grace stepped forward instinctively. "Sir, the renewal date is correct." "It's clearly an office delay, so—" Victor cut her off with a glare. "Are you questioning my judgment now?" Grace stopped speaking. Victor turned back to Nasir. "You've been a problem lately, talking too much, standing where you shouldn't, making people forget their place." Nasir met his gaze steadily. "If I've caused offense, that was not my intention." Victor scoffed. "Your intention doesn't matter. Your impact does." He folded the papers slowly, deliberately. "You're suspended, effective immediately." A gasp rippled through the small crowd. Tunda took a step forward. "Sir, please," Victor snapped. "Another word and you'll join him." Tunde froze. Nasir took a slow breath. "Understood, sir." Grace stared at him. "You can't just—" Nasir turned slightly toward her and shook his head gently but firmly. A silent request. "Don't." Victor seemed disappointed by Nasir's lack of reaction. He had expected anger, begging, fear. Instead, Nasir simply removed his cap and placed it carefully on the hood of the car. "I'll hand over the keys," he said calmly. Victor waved him off. "Security will handle that." Two guards approached, visibly uncomfortable. One of them avoided Nasir's eyes as he took the keys. Nasir nodded politely to both men. "Thank you." Then he turned and walked away from the vehicle, away from the role he had worn like a second skin. As he crossed the yard, whispers followed him. That's it for him. He pushed too far. Victor finally dealt with him. Grace felt her chest tighten. She wanted to run after him, to say something, anything, but her legs wouldn't move. Nasir reached the gate and paused briefly, looking back at the compound, not with regret, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding, as if this moment had always been part of the path. Then he stepped out. Inside the building, Victor basked in the aftermath. He straightened his jacket, satisfied. "That's how you maintain discipline," he said loudly, ensuring everyone heard. "No one is bigger than this company." Linda smiled approvingly. About time. He was getting too comfortable. But beneath Victor's confidence, something gnawed at him. The victory felt hollow, too easy, and for reasons he couldn't explain, Nasir's calm exit unsettled him more than any argument would have. The rest of the day dragged on. Without Nasir, small cracks began to show almost immediately. A driver hesitated at a route decision Nasir would have resolved instinctively. A minor mechanical issue went unnoticed until it caused a delay. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to be felt. Tunde noticed too. He finished his shift late, his mind heavy. As he walked toward the gate, he spotted Nasir sitting on a low wall outside the compound, his small bag beside him. "Oga Nasir," Tunde said softly, approaching. Nasir looked up and smiled. "You're done for the day." Tunde swallowed hard. "I'm so sorry." Nasir shook his head. "Don't be. They suspended you because of me, because of all the things you helped with." Nasir chuckled quietly. "No, they suspended me because the truth was getting close." Tunde frowned. "What will you do now?" Nasir looked out toward the road where buses and bikes weaved through traffic. "I'll wait. For what?" "For the right moment." Tunde's eyes filled with tears. "You don't deserve this." Nasir stood and placed a hand on Tunde's shoulder. "Deserve has nothing to do with timing. Go home. Rest." Tunde hesitated. "Will you come back?" Nasir met his eyes. "Yes." Inside the office, Grace sat at her desk long after most employees had left. She replayed the scene again and again. Victor's voice. Nasir's silence, the way no one had stopped it. She felt ashamed. Not of Nasir, of herself. She opened her laptop and pulled up records, meeting logs, approval chains, internal emails. If Victor thought suspending Nasir would restore control, he was wrong. It had only sharpened her resolve. Meanwhile, Victor went home that evening convinced he had reasserted dominance. He poured himself a drink and told Linda, "Sometimes you have to cut off a bad limb to save the body." Linda nodded, unconcerned. The company will forget him by Monday. But Victor slept poorly. His dreams were restless, filled with unfinished conversations and calm eyes that refused to look away. Back in his room, Nasir sat quietly, the suspension letter folded neatly on the table. He read it once more, not for content, but for confirmation. The final barrier had been crossed. He picked up his phone and made a single call. "It's time," he said calmly. On the other end, the voice answered equally calm. "The board will be ready." Nasir ended the call and leaned back, closing his eyes. The insults had reached their peak. The dismissal had been delivered. And now the silence that followed was no longer patience. It was preparation. Saturday morning broke with a pale, uncertain light, the kind that promised heat later but offered no comfort now. Nasir Ahmed was awake before dawn, seated at the small table in his room, his phone resting beside a cup of untouched tea. The suspension letter lay folded neatly near his hand. He had slept little, not because of anger or fear, but because of a feeling he knew too well. Something was coming. The phone rang just after sunrise. Nasir answered immediately. "Yes." The voice on the other end trembled. "Nasir, it's your mother." His chest tightened. "What happened? She collapsed this morning. We rushed her to St. Raphael Mercy Hospital. The doctors—" The words broke apart. "They say it's serious." Nasir was already standing, reaching for his jacket. "I'm coming." The city was louder than usual as he stepped outside, as if Lagos itself had decided not to grant him silence. Buses roared past. Vendors shouted. Life moved forward without pause, indifferent to the fear pressing down on his chest. At the hospital, the midday sun beat down mercilessly on the crowded entrance. Families gathered in clusters, some praying, some arguing, some crying openly. Nasir pushed through them, his heart pounding harder with each step. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and anxiety filled the air. He spotted his aunt, first sitting stiffly on a plastic chair, her eyes swollen from tears. When she saw Nasir, she stood quickly. "She's in emergency," she said. "They took her in not long ago." Nasir nodded, forcing himself to remain steady. "Have you spoken to the doctor?" She shook her head. "They're still running tests." Minutes stretched into an hour. Nasir paced the corridor slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. He listened to the sounds of the hospital machines, beeping nurses, calling names, footsteps rushing past. Every sound felt too loud, too sharp. Then footsteps approached with purpose. Doc Doster. Samuel Adeyemi emerged from the emergency ward, his expression serious but composed. His eyes scanned the waiting area before settling on Nasir. "Mr. Ahmed," he said, stepping forward. Nasir met him halfway. "Doctor," Dr. Adeyemi lowered his voice, "your mother suffered a major cardiac episode. We've stabilized her for now, but she needs immediate intervention. There are decisions that cannot wait." Nasir nodded once. "Tell me what's needed." As they spoke, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Well, this is unexpected." Nasir turned. Linda Okafor stood near the entrance, sunglasses perched on her head, her expression a mix of surprise and mild disdain. Beside her was Victor Okafor, his face tightening the moment he recognized Nasir. "What are you doing here?" Victor asked sharply. Nasir's voice remained calm. "My mother is in emergency." Victor glanced around, then scoffed. "I didn't know drivers brought their family drama into public hospitals." Linda laughed softly. "Honestly, Victor, everywhere we go." Nasir ignored her and turned back to Dr. Adeyemi. "Please continue." But Victor wasn't done. "I hope you're not expecting special treatment," Victor said loudly. "This hospital is full of people with real emergencies." Several heads turned. Dr. Adeyemi's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sir," he said firmly, "every patient here has a real emergency." Victor raised his hands mockingly. "Of course, doctor. I'm just saying." Nasir stepped slightly forward, his voice low but steady. "This is not the place." Victor stared at him, incredulous. "You're suspended, remember? You don't get to tell me anything." Linda leaned closer to Victor. "Let's go. We have an appointment upstairs." Victor hesitated, then smirked. "Fine. But don't worry," he said to Nasir. "People like you always find a way to survive." They walked past, their laughter echoing faintly down the corridor. Grace Williams, standing a few steps away with a file in her hand, had witnessed everything. Her stomach twisted. She watched Nasir remain where he was, his face unreadable, though his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. Dr. Adeyemi cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Ahmed, we need your consent to proceed. Time is critical." Nasir nodded. "Do whatever you must." As the doctor turned to leave, Grace stepped closer. "Nasir," she said softly. He looked at her, surprised. "Grace, I'm sorry," she said, "for everything." Nasir studied her face for a moment. "Thank you for being here." They sat together in silence as hours dragged on. The sun shifted outside, casting harsh light through the windows. Families came and went. Some rejoiced, others wept. Finally, Dr. Adeyemi returned. "We've done what we can for now," he said. "She's stable, but the next 24 hours are crucial." Nasir exhaled slowly, the tension easing just enough for him to breathe. "Can I see her?" Dr. Adeyemi nodded. Inside the ward, Nasir stood beside his mother's bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. Her face looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way that stirred memories of his childhood, of her hands guiding him, encouraging him, believing in him when no one else did. He reached for her hand gently. "I'm here," he whispered. Outside the room, Grace watched from a distance, emotion pressing against her chest. She had never seen Nasir look anything but composed. Now the weight he carried was visible, undeniable. Later that afternoon, Victor and Linda returned to the waiting area, their appointment finished. Victor spotted Nasir again and frowned. "You're still here?" he asked. Nasir didn't respond. Victor scoffed. "Some people just don't know when to move on." Grace stepped forward before she could stop herself. "Sir," she said, "this is inappropriate." Victor turned on her. "Excuse me. This is a hospital." Grace continued, her voice steady despite her fear. "Please show some respect." For a moment, Victor looked stunned, then his face hardened. "Careful, Grace." Nasir placed a hand lightly on Grace's arm. "It's okay," he said quietly. Victor watched the exchange, irritation flashing across his face. "You really think you're untouchable now?" he muttered. Nasir met his gaze calmly. "No," Victor snorted. "Good." As Victor and Linda walked away, Grace felt something inside her solidify. The line had been crossed not just for Nasir, but for everyone watching. As evening approached, Nasir stepped outside the hospital for air. The sun was beginning to dip, the heat easing slightly. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a brief moment. His phone vibrated. A message from the board's liaison appeared on the screen. "Everything is set." Nasir typed back a single word. "Tomorrow." He looked back toward the hospital doors where lives hung in balance and truth waited patiently. The crisis had become personal now, and when personal and professional worlds collided, there would be no room left for denial. Sunday arrived without rest. The night at St. Raphael Mercy Hospital had stretched endlessly, broken only by the beeping of machines and the quiet shuffling of nurses changing shifts. Nasir Ahmed sat upright in a hard plastic chair outside his mother's ward. His jacket folded neatly beside him. He had not slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw her face as it had been when he was a boy. Strong, reassuring, unshakable. Seeing her now fragile and dependent on machines cut deeper than any insult Victor Okafor had ever thrown his way. Grace Williams arrived early that morning carrying a small paper bag. She hesitated before approaching, unsure if her presence would be welcome. Nasir noticed her immediately. "You didn't have to come," he said gently. Grace offered the bag. "I brought tea and bread. I thought you might not have eaten." Nasir accepted it with a nod. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the hospital wake up around them. Somewhere down the corridor, a baby cried. A nurse laughed softly. Life insisted on continuing. Grace finally spoke. "I keep thinking about yesterday." Nasir glanced at her. "The hospital, and everything before it," she replied. "The way they spoke to you, the way we all let it happen." Nasir took a slow sip of tea. "Silence is contagious," he said, "but so is courage." Grace swallowed. "I should have said more." Nasir met her eyes. "You said enough when it mattered." The doors at the far end of the corridor opened and Victor Okafor walked in, followed closely by Linda. They were dressed sharply, as if attending a social event rather than visiting a hospital. Victor's eyes scanned the area and landed on Nasir immediately. "Well," Victor said loudly, "this place never gets quieter, does it?" Nasir did not respond. Linda glanced toward the ward. "Is she still alive?" she asked casually. Grace stiffened. "That's a terrible thing to say." Victor waved her off. "Relax. I'm just asking." Nasir stood slowly. "Please," he said calmly. "This is not the time." Victor raised an eyebrow. "You don't get to tell me what time it is." Linda sighed dramatically. "Victor, we're wasting time here." Victor stepped closer to Nasir, lowering his voice. "You know," he said, "if you had focused on your job instead of pretending to be important, maybe your life would be less complicated." Grace gasped softly. "That's enough." Victor turned on her. "Stay out of this." Nasir held up a hand. "It's fine." Victor smirked, always playing the saint. At that moment, Dr. Samuel Adeyemi stepped out of the ward, his expression grave. His eyes went straight to Nasir. "Mr. Ahmed," he said, "we need to speak." Victor laughed under his breath. "See, everyone wants something from you today." Dr. Adeyemi ignored Victor entirely. "Your mother's condition has changed. We need to act quickly." Nasir's heart clenched. "What do you need?" Dr. Adeyemi hesitated. "There's a procedure that could stabilize her further, but it requires immediate authorization and resources. It's not something we can delay." Nasir nodded without hesitation. "Do it," Victor scoffed. "And how exactly do you plan to pay for that?" The words echoed down the corridor. Grace turned sharply. "Victor." Victor shrugged. "I'm just being realistic. Procedures like that aren't cheap." Nasir met Victor's gaze, his voice steady. "That won't be a problem." Victor laughed openly now. "Listen to him. The suspended driver is suddenly confident." Linda leaned in her tone, mocking. "Maybe he thinks the hospital will take pity on him." Dr. Adeyemi straightened. "Sir," he said firmly, "this conversation is inappropriate." Victor raised his hands. "Fine. Do whatever you want. Just don't expect miracles." As Victor and Linda walked away, Grace's hands shook. "I can't believe him," she whispered. Nasir watched them go, his expression unreadable. Inside, something hardened not into anger but into resolve. Hours passed. The procedure was performed. The waiting felt unbearable, each minute stretching longer than the last. Grace remained by Nasir's side, offering quiet support. She watched him closely, noticing the stillness he carried, even in fear. Finally, Dr. Adeyemi returned. "It was successful," he said. "She's stable for now." Nasir closed his eyes, briefly, relief washing through him. "Thank you, doctor." As Dr. Adeyemi turned to leave, he paused. "Mr. Ahmed, the administration has been informed. Everything is in order." Nasir nodded. "Good." Grace looked between them, confusion flickering across her face. In order, how Nasir smiled faintly. "You'll understand soon." Later that afternoon, as the sun poured through the hospital windows, Victor received a phone call. His face tightened as he listened, his confident posture stiffening. "What do you mean, tomorrow?" he snapped. "Who called the meeting?" He glanced across the waiting area, his eyes landing on Nasir. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his expression. Linda leaned toward him. "What is it?" Victor lowered his voice. "The board. Emergency meeting. First thing tomorrow." Linda frowned. About what? Victor hesitated. They didn't say. Across the room, Nasir sat calmly, his hands folded, his gaze steady. Grace watched Victor watch Nasir, and something clicked into place. A chill ran down her spine. That evening, as the hospital quieted once more, Nasir stood by his mother's bedside. He leaned close and whispered, "Rest. I'll handle the rest." He stepped out into the corridor, his phone vibrating again. Everything confirmed. The message read, "All members present." Nasir typed back, "Thank you." He slipped the phone into his pocket and took a deep breath. The insults, the humiliation, the dismissal, all of it had led here. The truth had been tested by pain, by patience, by restraint. Tomorrow there would be no more pretending. And for those who had mistaken silence for weakness, the morning would come with a reckoning they were not prepared to face. Monday morning arrived with a heavy stillness, the kind that made even the busiest streets of Lagos feel restrained. At Ahmed Logistics Limited, the compound looked the same as it always had, trucks lined up, guards at the gate. Staff arriving in neat clothes, but beneath the surface something was different. People felt it in their steps, in the way conversations paused mid-sentence, in how eyes followed one another more carefully than before. Victor Okafor arrived earlier than usual. His car pulled into the lot with unnecessary speed tires crunching against gravel. He stepped out sharply, straightened his jacket, and scanned the yard as if daring someone to challenge him. He did not see Nasir. For a brief moment, relief washed over him, then irritation followed. He preferred his victories visible. The absence felt unfinished. Inside the building, whispers rippled through the corridors. "Did you hear about the board meeting? They called it late last night. All of them are coming." Grace Williams sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard without typing. She had slept poorly, her mind replaying scenes from the hospital again and again. Victor's cruelty, Nasir's composure, the way Dr. Adeyemi had spoken to Nasser with quiet respect. Something was coming. She could feel it. At exactly 9 o'clock, an email notification chimed across the office network. Mandatory meeting, all senior staff, main boardroom, 9:30 a.m. Victor read it twice, his jaw tightening. He hadn't authorized it. That alone unsettled him. "Linda," he snapped, dialing his wife immediately. "Are you seeing this?" "Yes," Linda replied. "What's going on?" "Don't know," Victor said sharply, "but I will find out." At St. Raphael Mercy Hospital, Nasir Ahmed stood beside his mother's bed, adjusting the thin blanket around her shoulders. She was sleeping now, her breathing slow and steady. Dr. Adeyemi had assured him she was stable enough for him to step away briefly. Nasir leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "I'll be back soon," he whispered. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open for a moment. "Nasir," she murmured weakly. "I'm here," he said softly. She searched his face as if sensing something. "You've always been patient," she whispered, "but don't let patience make you small." Nasir smiled. It never did. He stepped out of the ward and into the bright Lagos morning. The sun was already high, the heat rising fast. He adjusted his jacket, not the worn driver's uniform this time, but a simple, well-fitted suit he hadn't worn in months. As he walked toward the waiting car, Dr. Adeyemi watched from the doorway, a knowing look in his eyes. "Good luck," the doctor said quietly. Nasir nodded. "Thank you." Back at Ahmed Logistics, the boardroom filled quickly. Senior managers took their seats, exchanging nervous glances. No one spoke above a whisper. Laptops were opened, notebooks laid out, phones silenced. Victor entered last, as always expecting eyes to turn toward him. They didn't. At the head of the table sat 3 members of the Ahmed Holdings board, men and women whose names rarely appeared in daily operations. Their expressions were serious, unreadable. Victor forced a smile. "Good morning," he said loudly. "I wasn't informed of the purpose of this meeting, but I assume." The woman at the center of the table raised a hand gently. "Sit down, Victor." The tone was calm, final. Victor hesitated, then sat. Grace slipped into a seat near the far end, her heart pounding. Tunda Balogan, present as a junior representative, clutched his notebook tightly, unsure why he had been invited. The door opened again. Silence fell instantly. Nasir Ahmed walked in. For a moment no one moved. Some didn't recognize him at first, not without the driver's uniform, not standing straight, not walking with quiet authority. Then recognition spread like electricity. Grace's breath caught. Tunde's eyes widened. Victor froze. Nasir walked calmly to the front of the room and stopped beside the board members. He placed his hands lightly on the table and looked around the room, not with pride, not with anger, but with clarity. "Good morning," he said evenly. Victor stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "What is he doing here?" he demanded. "This man is suspended." One of the board members turned to Victor. "No," he said quietly. "He is not." Victor laughed nervously. "This is a mistake." Nasir met Victor's eyes. "Sit down, Victor." The room seemed to hold its breath. Victor's face flushed. "You don't get to—" "Sit." Nasir repeated, his voice calm but immovable. Something in that tone, something undeniable, made Victor's knees weaken. Slowly, unwillingly, he sat. Nasir turned to the room. "For those of you who don't know me beyond the role I've been playing, allow me to introduce myself properly." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "My name is Nasser Ahmed, founder and chairman of Ahmed Holdings Group." The words landed like thunder. Grace felt her hands tremble. Tunde's mouth fell open. A ripple of shock moved through the room, chairs shifting, gasps escaping, eyes darting from Nasser to Victor and back again. Victor shook his head violently. "No, this is not possible," Nasser continued calmly. "For the past several months I have worked within this company as a driver, not as a test of loyalty, not as a trick, but as an observation." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the room. "I wanted to see how power was used when no one thought I was watching." Victor stood again, panic bleeding into his voice. "This is insane. You expect us to believe one of the board members opened a folder and slid documents across the table?" "You will believe it," she said, "because it is true." Victor stared at the papers, his hands shaking. Nasir's gaze softened, not in mercy, but in disappointment. "Victor Okafor, he said you were hired for your competence. You rose because you showed promise. But somewhere along the way, you forgot something fundamental." Victor swallowed hard. "Sir, you forgot that leadership is not measured by how loudly you speak?" Nasir continued, "but by how you treat those who cannot speak back." The room was utterly silent now. Nasir took a breath. "I was called useless. I was shouted at. I was dismissed. And through it all, I listened." He looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "Today is not about revenge. It is about truth." Victor's world was collapsing piece by piece, and for the first time since he had entered the room, he understood something terrifying. He had never known who Nasser Ahmed truly was. The silence in the boardroom stretched longer than anyone expected. It was not the kind of silence filled with confusion alone, but one weighted with realization. Realization that every word spoken in this room, every action taken in the past months, now stood exposed under an unforgiving light. Victor Okafor was the first to break it. This has to be some kind of setup," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You can't just walk in here," and Nasir Ahmed raised a hand gently, not in threat, but in finality. Victor's voice died instantly. Nasir turned to the board members. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," he said. "I know this meeting disrupted your schedules." The woman at the center of the table nodded. This meeting was overdue. Nasir inclined his head slightly, then faced the room again. "I asked for everyone here today because what happens next must be witnessed, not whispered, not filtered through rumors." He looked toward Grace Williams. "Grace, thank you for being here." Grace straightened, startled. "Sir?" "You represent the administrative heart of this company," Nasir said, "the place where policies meet people." Grace swallowed and nodded. Nasser then turned to Tunde Balogun. "And you, Tunde, represent those whose voices are often ignored." Tunde's hands shook as he stood halfway out of his seat. "Sir, I don't understand why I'm here." "You will," Nasir replied gently, "very soon." Victor cleared his throat loudly, trying to reclaim attention. "With all due respect, sir, if you truly are who you say you are, then this could have been handled privately." Nasir looked at him calmly, and that he said is exactly the problem. He walked slowly around the table, speaking as he moved. "Private conversations protect individuals. Public accountability protects cultures." Victor's jaw tightened. Nasir stopped beside a projector screen. One of the board members nodded to an assistant who pressed a button. The screen lit up. Internal emails appeared. Timestamps. Names. Nasir spoke without looking at Victor. Over the past 6 months, I documented patterns of behavior. Not mistakes. Patterns. The first email highlighted Victor's name dismissing a junior employee's concern with a mocking response. Another showed budget approvals rerouted without proper authorization. A third revealed complaints quietly closed without investigation. Victor stood again, voice rising. This is taken out of context. Nasir turned to him. Then provide the context. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it. The board member nearest to Victor spoke. Mr. Okafor, we have reviewed these records independently. Another board member added. We have also spoken to staff confidentially. Victor's face drained of color. Nasir faced the room again. When I took on the role of a driver, I did not expect kindness. I expected honesty. What I found instead was fear. He gestured toward the chairs around him, people afraid to speak, afraid to question, afraid to suggest. His gaze settled briefly on Grace, then on Tunde. That fear, Nasir continued, did not come from company policy. It came from leadership behavior. Victor slammed his hand on the table. You think running a company is about being nice? Nasir didn't flinch. No, he said, it's about being just. The word hung heavy in the air. Nasir continued. When mistakes were made, they were hidden. When solutions were offered, they were mocked. And when humility was shown, it was mistaken for weakness. Victor's voice cracked. I built results. You built compliance. Nasir replied calmly. Not trust. He turned to the board. Trust is the currency that keeps a company alive long after profits fade. The woman at the center of the table folded her hands. Mr. Ahmed, she said, what are you proposing? Nasir took a breath. Immediate action. Victor laughed bitterly. Of course. Nasir met his gaze. Victor Okafor, effective immediately, you are removed from your position as operations manager of Ahmed Logistics Limited. The words landed like a blow. Victor staggered backward slightly. You will also be placed under internal and external review for financial and ethical misconduct. Nasir continued evenly. The evidence has already been submitted. Linda, who had been sitting silently near the wall, stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. One of the board members turned to her. Mrs. Okafor, your administrative privileges have also been suspended pending review. Linda froze. Victor looked around the room desperately. You're all making a mistake. Nasir stepped closer to him, not looming, not threatening, just present. The mistake, he said quietly, was confusing authority with entitlement. Victor's shoulders sagged. For the first time, there was no anger left, only shock. Nasir turned back to the room. This company will not heal overnight, he said, but today it will begin. He gestured toward Tunde Balogun. Tunde stood fully now, legs trembling. Yes, sir, you followed instructions under pressure and were blamed for outcomes beyond your control, Nasir said. That ends today. He looked to the board. I recommend Tunde for the driver-supervisor training program effective immediately. Gasps rippled through the room. Tunde's eyes filled with tears. Sir, thank you. Nasir smiled gently. Earn it. He then turned to Grace. Grace Williams. Grace stood, heart pounding. Yes, sir. You showed integrity when it was risky, Nasir said, and restraint when it was easier to stay silent. He nodded toward the board. Grace will serve as interim administrative compliance lead while we review internal processes. Grace felt the room tilt slightly. I won't fail. Nasir inclined his head. I know. The meeting continued for another hour. Policies were outlined, oversight committees established, reporting channels opened. One by one, the systems that had enabled silence were dismantled. Victor remained seated, staring at the table as if the surface might open and swallow him whole. When the meeting finally adjourned, people stood slowly, unsure how to move forward after witnessing something so profound. As staff filed out, Grace passed Nasir and paused. You changed everything, she said quietly. Nasir shook his head. No, the truth did. Tunde approached next, his voice thick with emotion. I'll never forget what you did for us. Nasir placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. Then make sure you don't repeat what you saw. Victor was the last to leave. At the doorway, he stopped and turned back. You could have destroyed me quietly, he said hoarsely. Why didn't you? Nasir met his gaze. Because quiet destruction teaches nothing. Victor swallowed hard, then walked out. Nasir remained alone in the boardroom for a moment longer, looking at the empty chairs. He exhaled slowly. The truth had been spoken, and now the real work could begin. The aftermath of the board meeting rippled through Ahmed Logistics Limited like a slow, powerful wave. By midday, the news had reached every corner of the compound, every floor of the building, every driver parked along the routes. People didn't shout about it. They didn't celebrate openly. Instead, they spoke in lowered voices, eyes wide with disbelief, as if afraid the truth might still vanish if acknowledged too loudly. Victor Okafor was gone, not escorted out dramatically, not dragged through the yard. He left quietly, carrying a single leather briefcase that suddenly looked far heavier than it ever had before. Heads turned as he passed, not with fear anymore, but with something closer to stunned curiosity. The man who had once filled spaces with his voice now seemed smaller, diminished by the weight of consequences. Nasir Ahmed watched none of it. He stood alone in his office, his real office now, the one he had built years ago and then abandoned on purpose. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows, illuminating shelves that still held awards and framed certificates bearing his name. He had not touched any of them. They felt like echoes from a life that no longer defined him. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," Nasir said. Grace Williams stepped inside, holding a tablet pressed tightly to her chest. Her posture was upright, but her eyes revealed a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Sir," she began, then stopped, uncertain. Nasir smiled gently. "You can speak freely?" She took a breath. "The internal audit team has begun reviewing Victor's files. There are more irregularities than we expected." Nasir nodded slowly. "That is often the case." Grace hesitated. "Some people are scared. They're asking if more dismissals are coming." Nasir leaned back slightly. "Change always frightens those who benefited from silence. Reassure the rest, this is not a purge. It's a correction." Grace relaxed slightly. "Understood." As she turned to leave, Nasir added grace. She paused. "Thank you," he said simply. Her eyes softened. "Thank you for trusting me." When she left, Nasir allowed himself a moment of stillness. The room felt different now, not lighter, but clearer. Like a space finally aired out after years of being sealed shut. Across the compound, Tunda Balogan stood near a group of drivers listening as they spoke excitedly. "Did you hear? He was the owner all along. No wonder he knew the roads like that. Imagine calling the boss useless." Tunde didn't smile. He remembered Nasir sitting beside him on a low concrete step, speaking calmly while the world pressed down on him. He remembered the quiet dignity, the patience. Power had not changed Nasir. It had simply returned to where it belonged. Later that afternoon, Nasir walked through the compound, not as a driver waiting by a car, but as the man everyone now knew him to be. Conversations paused. Some people stood straighter. Others looked away ashamed. Nasir noticed everything. He stopped near a group of cleaners who froze the moment they saw him. "Good afternoon," Nasir said warmly. "Good afternoon, sir," they replied in unison. Nasir nodded. "Thank you for your work. This place runs because of you." Their faces lit up with surprise. He continued walking, stopping briefly to speak with drivers, security guards, junior staff, asking questions, listening carefully. Not as a performance, as a continuation of what he had always done. In the administrative wing, Linda Okafor sat alone in a small waiting room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The arrogance that once wrapped around her like armor had cracked. Her administrative access had been suspended, her influence erased in a single morning. When Nasir passed by, she stood quickly. "Sir," she said, her voice tight. Nasir stopped. I didn't know," she said, words tumbling over one another. "If I had known who you were," Nasir met her gaze calmly. "Would you have spoken differently?" Linda's mouth opened, then closed. She had no answer. Nasir nodded once. "That is the lesson." He walked away, leaving her alone with the realization that respect based on titles was not respect at all. By evening, the company had issued an internal statement outlining leadership changes and reaffirming its commitment to ethical conduct. There were no names mentioned, no dramatic language, just clarity. At St. Raphael Mercy Hospital, Nasir returned to his mother's bedside. She was awake now, her eyes clearer, her breathing steady. She looked up as he entered. "You look lighter," she said softly. Nasir smiled. "I told the truth." She squeezed his hand weakly. It always costs something. Yes, he agreed, but it also gives something back. Outside the room, Dr. Adeyemi waited. Your mother is responding well, he said. She'll need time, but she's strong. Nasir exhaled deeply. Thank you, doctor. Dr. Adeyemi studied him for a moment. You know, most people with your power would have crushed their enemies quietly. Nasir shook his head. I wasn't trying to crush anyone. Then what were you trying to do, build something that lasts? As night settled over Lagos, the city hummed on, unaware of the quiet transformation that had begun inside one company. There were no headlines, no applause, just a shift subtle but irreversible. Back at Ahmed Logistics, the compound lights glowed softly. Tunda locked up his section for the night, pausing to look around. For the first time since he started working there, he felt hope without fear. In his office, Nasir sat at his desk reviewing reports, not just numbers, but stories. Stories of people who had been overlooked, of voices silenced, of systems that needed repair. The truth had been revealed, but revelation was only the beginning. Now came responsibility. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, as if Ahmed Logistics Limited was learning how to breathe again. Not the shallow, anxious breathing it had lived with for years, but something slower, deeper, unfamiliar. The kind of calm that comes after a storm has passed, and the damage must finally be assessed. Nasir Ahmed allowed that quiet to exist. He did not rush into grand speeches or dramatic reforms. Instead, he spent his mornings walking through departments, sitting in on meetings without announcing himself, listening more than he spoke. People noticed. They also relaxed just a little when they realized he was not there to intimidate, but to understand. Yet outside the compound, the consequences were unfolding quickly. Victor Okafor's removal did not go unnoticed in Lagos's business circles. By midweek, rumors had turned into headlines whispered across offices and cafes. An internal investigation had become an external one. Financial auditors arrived unannounced. Legal letters were sent. Accounts were frozen. Victor sat alone in his apartment staring at a phone that no longer rang. Linda paced behind him, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Say something, she demanded. You can't just sit there. Victor rubbed his temples. What do you want me to say? That this is a mistake? That they'll fix it? Victor laughed weakly. Fix what? The truth. Linda stopped pacing. You think this is all your fault? Victor didn't answer. Say it, she pressed. You think this is because of how you treated that driver? Victor finally looked up at her, his eyes tired. He wasn't just a driver, Linda scoffed. So what? That excuses everything? Victor stood slowly. No, he said. It explains it. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Back at Ahmed Logistics, Tunda Balogun stood in a small training room, staring at a whiteboard covered in route diagrams and scheduling charts. The supervisor program had started faster than he expected. His new badge felt strange on his chest, lighter than fear, heavier than pride. He raised his hand tentatively. Sir, he said to the trainer, can I suggest an adjustment to this route? The trainer nodded. Go ahead. Tunde swallowed, then spoke. His voice shook at first, but steadied as he continued. When he finished, the trainer smiled. That's a good observation, he said. Let's test it. Tunda sat down, heart pounding. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of being heard. Grace Williams experienced her own transformation. Her new role as interim compliance lead came with pressure she hadn't anticipated. Files piled up. Interviews stretched long into the evening. Some staff avoided her. Others sought her out quietly, sharing stories they had never dared to voice before. One afternoon, she sat across from a junior clerk who twisted her fingers nervously. I didn't speak up before the woman whispered. I was scared. Grace nodded. I know. Is it too late? Grace shook her head gently. It's only too late when nothing changes. Slowly, patterns emerged. Small abuses of power, dismissed complaints, fear disguised as efficiency. Each story added weight to Nasir's original decision. Nasir reviewed Grace's findings carefully, not with anger, but with resolve. This is not about punishment, he reminded her. It's about rebuilding trust. Meanwhile, employees who had once hidden behind Victor's authority found themselves exposed to a new reality, one without shouting, without threats, without easy excuses. Some adapted, others didn't. A senior manager resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. Another attempted to justify past behavior, only to find that explanations no longer carried the same weight. Nasir addressed the leadership team at the end of the week. Accountability is not humiliation, he said calmly, but neither is it optional. The room was silent, attentive. If you cannot lead without fear, Nasir continued, then you cannot lead here. There was no applause. None was needed. At the hospital, Nasir's mother continued to recover. Each day she grew a little stronger, her voice clearer, her smile returning in small, precious moments. One afternoon, she squeezed Nasir's hand and said, "I watched you grow by how you treated people when you had nothing." He smiled. "I never forgot." She nodded. "Then you won't lose yourself now." Outside the hospital room, Dr. Adeyemi spoke quietly with Nasir. "Your company is changing," he said. "People talk." Nasir smiled faintly. "People always talk." "Yes," the doctor replied. "But this time, they're listening." Back at the compound, something subtle but profound was taking root. Drivers greeted supervisors without fear. Cleaners were thanked by name. Meetings ended with questions instead of commands. Not everything was perfect. Mistakes still happened. Tension still surfaced, but the difference lay in how those moments were handled. One evening, Nasir stood alone in the yard as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with orange and gold. Grace approached him holding a folder. "We've completed the first phase of the review," she said. "It's difficult." Nasir took the folder but did not open it immediately. Change always is. Grace hesitated. "Do you ever regret it?" Nasir looked out at the parked trucks, the people moving freely between them. "Regret what?" "Not stopping it sooner." Nasir considered the question carefully. "If I had stopped it sooner, the lesson would have been smaller, quieter." Grace nodded slowly. At that moment, Tunde walked past laughing with another driver. The sound carried across the yard light unburdened. Nasir smiled. Across the city, Victor watched the news report in silence as analysts discussed leadership ethics and corporate accountability. His name was never mentioned directly, but he recognized himself in every careful phrase. Linda turned off the television abruptly. "They're enjoying this," she said bitterly. Victor leaned back against the couch. "No," he said quietly. "They're learning from it." Linda stared at him. "And what are you learning?" Victor closed his eyes. "That power doesn't protect you from who you are." The company moved forward, not with triumph, not with celebration, but with intention. The shouting had ended, the insults had lost their power, and in their place something stronger was forming slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Respect. Change rarely announces itself with noise. At Ahmed Logistics Limited, it arrived quietly in the rhythm of daily work in the spaces between conversations. By the start of the second week after the board meeting, the company no longer felt like a place holding its breath. It felt like a place learning to speak again. Nasir Ahmed watched it unfold with careful restraint. He resisted the urge to stand at the front and declare victory. He knew better. Systems didn't heal because one man revealed the truth. They healed because people chose day after day to behave differently. So he focused on structure. The first leadership workshop began on a Wednesday morning. No podium, no speeches, just chairs arranged in a circle. Managers, supervisors, and team leads sat awkwardly, at first unsure how to exist without hierarchy clearly marked. Nasir entered last and took an empty seat among them. A murmur passed through the room, then silence. "I'm not here to lecture," Nasir said calmly. "I'm here to listen." That alone unsettled them. He asked one simple question. What stops people from telling the truth at work? At first, no one answered. Then a woman from procurement spoke. Fear. A man from fleet maintenance followed. Pride. Another voice added quietly, punishment. Nasir nodded, letting each word settle. None of those improve performance, he said. They only improve control. Over the next 2 hours, stories emerged. Not accusations, but experiences. Moments when people chose silence. Times when they watched injustice and looked away. The room grew heavier, then lighter as honesty replaced defensiveness. Grace Williams watched from the back, taking notes. She had facilitated meetings before, but never like this. There was no posturing, no blame shifting, just people confronting themselves. Later that day, a new reporting channel went live, anonymous, protected, monitored by an independent ethics team. Nasir insisted on one condition: every report would receive a response even if action wasn't immediate. Silence is the enemy, he said. Tunde Balogun felt the change most sharply on the road. As part of his supervisor training, he rode along with drivers, listening to their frustrations and ideas. For the first time, he felt authorized not just by title, but by trust. When a driver complained about unrealistic delivery timelines, Tunde took notes instead of dismissing him. "I'll take this up," he said. "And they'll listen?" the driver asked skeptically. Tunde smiled. "Yes." At the end of the week, Nasir joined the drivers for lunch in the open yard. No reserved table, no escort, just a tray of food and a seat on a low bench. Conversation faltered at first, then flowed. One driver finally spoke. "Sir, why didn't you tell us who you were?" Nasir chewed slowly before answering. "Because I didn't want obedience. I wanted honesty." Another asked, "Did it hurt, being treated like that?" Nasir met his eyes. "It taught me what titles hide." The drivers nodded. Understanding more than words could explain. Not everyone welcomed the change. A middle manager named Paul confronted Grace privately. "This new system is slowing things down," he complained. "We're spending too much time listening." Grace looked at him steadily. "Listening prevents bigger problems later." Paul scoffed. "That driver Nasir, he embarrassed a lot of people." Grace's voice remained calm. "No?" He revealed them. Paul said nothing more, but his discomfort lingered. For some, accountability felt like exposure. Nasser noticed. One evening he called Paul into his office, not to threaten but to clarify. "You're struggling," Nasser said plainly. Paul stiffened. "I deliver results." "I don't doubt that," Nasser replied, "but results without integrity rot from the inside." Paul hesitated. "What if people take advantage of this openness?" Nasir leaned forward. "Then leadership must be present, not loud, present." Paul left thoughtful, unsettled, but listening. At the hospital, Nasir's mother took her first steps down the corridor with the help of a nurse. Her strength was returning slowly, stubbornly. "You've been busy," she said later, sitting by the window. "Yes," Nasir replied. "Do you feel lighter?" He considered it. "I feel clearer." She smiled. "That's better." Back at the company, a small incident tested the new culture. A delivery error caused a missed deadline. Instead of shouting, the team gathered to review what happened. The driver explained. The scheduler admitted an oversight. Together they adjusted the process. No one was humiliated. No one was silenced. When the meeting ended, a junior staff member whispered to Grace, "Is this how it's supposed to work?" Grace smiled. "Yes, word spread not as gossip but as proof. Clients noticed too." One longtime partner sent an email praising improved communication and transparency. Another requested a meeting, curious about the change in tone they had sensed. Nasir responded personally. "We are learning to align values with operations," he wrote. "It takes time." The city of Lagos moved as it always did, fast, loud, relentless. But inside Ahmed Logistics, the pace felt intentional. On Friday evening, Nasir stood in the boardroom alone. Lights dimmed the city, glowing beyond the windows. He thought of Victor not with satisfaction, but with sober understanding. He thought of the insults, the patience, the long wait. Grace entered quietly. "The first compliance report is ready," she said. Nasir took it. "How do you feel?" She exhaled. "Tired, hopeful." He smiled. "That's the work." As she left, Nasser looked around the room one last time. Power had not been taken. It had been reframed. Outside, Tunde locked up the yard and paused, listening to the quiet. He smiled to himself. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different one. The final weeks of the quarter arrived without drama, without raised voices, without the sharp tension that once defined Ahmed Logistics Limited. From the outside, nothing spectacular seemed to have happened. Trucks still moved in and out of the compound. Meetings still filled the calendar. Deadlines still pressed. But inside, everything had changed. Nasir Ahmed no longer needed to walk the halls to feel it. The shift was audible in how people spoke to one another. It was visible in how problems were raised instead of hidden. It was tangible in the absence of fear. On a warm Thursday morning, Nasir called for a company-wide gathering in the open yard. No stage was built, no banners were hung. Employees gathered in loose groups, curious but calm. Nasir stood among them, not above them. "I won't keep you long," he began. His voice carried easily, not because it was loud, but because people were listening. "I didn't call you here to celebrate a person. I called you here to acknowledge a moment." He looked around at the drivers, the cleaners, the supervisors, the office staff. Faces that once avoided his gaze now met it steadily. There was a time, Nasir continued, when some voices mattered more than others in this company. That time is over. A ripple moved through the crowd. You've all seen what happens when silence is mistaken for loyalty and cruelty is mistaken for strength, he said. We won't repeat that. He gestured toward Tunda Balogan standing a few steps away. Leadership is not a title, it's behavior, every day. Tunda swallowed hard, emotion flickering across his face. And to those who were hurt here, Nasir added, I won't ask you to forget. I ask you to help us build better. The gathering ended without applause. None was needed. People returned to work with something new in their posture, not pride, not relief, but ownership. Later that afternoon, Grace Williams sat across from Nasir in his office reviewing final compliance summaries. You know, she said, people still talk about the day you revealed yourself. Nasir smiled faintly. I imagine they will for a while. They say you humiliated Victor. Nasir shook his head. Victor humiliated himself. I just stopped covering the mirror. Grace nodded slowly. Some still expect you to punish more people. Nasir leaned back. Punishment changes behavior temporarily. Understanding changes it permanently. Grace closed her folder. Then we're on the right path. Across the city, Victor Okafor sat in a sparsely furnished office meeting with a lawyer. The man spoke carefully, professionally, outlining consequences, options, timelines. Victor barely listened. His mind replayed moments he could not undo, the laughter, the insults, the certainty that power protected him. He remembered Nasja's calm eyes in the boardroom, the absence of anger, the weight of disappointment. When the lawyer finished, Victor nodded numbly. Thank you. He stepped outside into the Lagos heat, suddenly aware of how loud the world felt without authority to shield him. For the first time in years, no one recognized him. No one feared him. The silence was unforgiving. Back at St. Raphael Mercy Hospital, Nasir's mother was discharged on a bright afternoon. She walked slowly beside him, leaning on his arm, her strength returning one careful step at a time. You didn't lose yourself, she said quietly as they reached the car. Nasir smiled. You taught me not to. She squeezed his hand. Then my work is done. At home that evening, Nasir sat alone on the balcony watching Lagos glow under the night sky. His phone buzzed with reports, messages, questions, but he set it aside. He thought of the months spent unnoticed, of the insults swallowed, of the patience tested, of the choice to wait instead of react. He had learned something essential. Power reveals itself not when you use it, but when you restrain it. The next morning, a new driver joined Ahmed Logistics. Nervous, young, unsure. As he waited by his assigned vehicle, Nasir passed by and nodded. Good morning. The young man straightened. Good morning, sir. Nasir paused. If you see something that doesn't make sense, speak up. The driver blinked. Really? Nasir smiled. Especially then, the driver nodded, a small smile forming. From a distance, Tunda watched the exchange and felt something settle deep in his chest. This was what change looked like. Not grand gestures, but quiet permission to be human. As the sun climbed higher, trucks rolled out, engines humming in steady rhythm. Work continued. Life continued. But somewhere between the noise and the movement, a lesson had taken root. They had called him a useless driver. They had shouted at him. And in doing so, they revealed not his worth, but their own blindness. Because true value does not announce itself with titles or volume. It waits. It watches. And when the time comes, it stands calm, undeniable, and unafraid. There are moments in life when silence speaks louder than shouting, and patience carries more power than pride. This story reminds us that a person's true worth is not measured by titles, uniforms, or how loudly they command a room. It is revealed in how they treat others when no one is watching, and how they endure injustice without letting it poison their character. Nasir was mocked, dismissed, and called useless not because he lacked value, but because others lacked vision. Those who shouted at him believed power was something you display. He understood that real power is something you carry quietly. By choosing patience over revenge and truth over ego, he allowed people to expose themselves. And when the truth finally surfaced, it did not need anger to be heard. It stood on its own. Life works the same way. Many times the world will misjudge you based on what it sees on the surface. You may be underestimated, overlooked, or treated unfairly. But your response in those moments defines who you become. Kindness is never weakness. Humility is never ignorance. And silence, when guided by wisdom, can be a form of strength. If this story moved you, Take a moment to reflect. Have you ever judged someone too quickly or been judged yourself? Share your thoughts and feelings in the comments. Your story might inspire someone who feels unseen today. And if you believe stories like this still matter, stories about dignity, justice, and hope, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep sharing messages that remind us all of the true value of being human.